Of course, very happy to. I'm Graham Brady. I'm a Conservative Member of Parliament. I represent a constituency in Greater Manchester called Altrincham and Sale West, just next door to Manchester Airport. It's probably the easiest way to pinpoint it on a map for your viewers. I've been a Member of Parliament since 1997, 23 years now. I've seen everything from the enormous New Labour landslide under Tony Blair through coalition government, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and majority government and minority government, and now since December seeing Conservative government with a good working majority. My background, I grew up in Altrincham. I went to Altrincham Grammar School. I've always been a great supporter of that system of academically selective schooling, which gets very good results. I went on to Durham University, where I took a degree in law, and then I worked in public affairs. But I found myself very fortunate to be selected as the Conservative candidate for my home constituency in Altrincham much sooner than I might have thought would have happened. And so I became a Member of Parliament quite young. I was still not quite 30 years old. But as I said, have now had quite a long time to see how Parliament works and sometimes how it doesn't. The 1922 committee, which I have chaired for the last 10 years, essentially it's the Parliamentary Conservative Party. It's called the 1922 committee because there was a very big Conservative intake of members of Parliament in 1922, and they took a few months trying to work out what was going on in Parliament, as we all do when we arrive, and they decided it would be a good idea to have a meeting once a week where they would try to find out what was happening and share best practice. And the idea caught on, and very soon all of the other Conservative MPs wanted to come to the meeting, and also they'd asked the Chief Whip if he would send one of the party whips to tell them what the business was every week, which I think has also ensured that far from being a kind of secret sect meeting in private, it's always been a rather open channel of communication between the front bench, in particular when we're in government, the Conservative government, and its backbench supporters. So a big part of my role is try to make sure that government understands what the parliamentary party is thinking and what the mood of the party is. Before I stood for election to be chairman of the 1922 committee, I'd done several jobs on the opposition front bench. I'd been Shadow Minister for Employment, for Schools. I was Parliamentary Private Secretary to Michael Howard when he was Leader of the Opposition. And then I was made Shadow Europe Minister, so I was quite steeped in European policy for some years as well. I ended up resigning from the Conservative front bench in 2007 when David Cameron was starting to criticise the grammar schools that were one of the things that brought me into politics in the first place. So I had to leave the front bench so that I could defend those excellent schools. And I'm pleased to say that we've still got them. Well, I think the response to the pandemic has been interesting. Right at the outset, back in late March, the government, when it proposed a very harsh lockdown, essentially of the whole country, took emergency powers in Parliament to allow it to do that. A number of us who are naturally libertarian in our instincts were prepared to go along with that because the very clear argument was advanced that it was possible that the intensive care capacity of the National Health Service could be overwhelmed, and that would be the thing that would lead to a very serious loss of life taking place. And some of the figures that were suggested were hundreds of thousands of people who could have lost their lives. Now, within that 3-week period, the initial 3 weeks of the lockdown, it became apparent that the intensive care capacity was not going to be overwhelmed, and that's partly because of some very impressive efforts from the National Health Service and indeed from the military in getting the so-called Nightingale hospitals set up. In fact, they were never needed, but there was a great reassurance to know that extra capacity was there. But also, it became apparent that the overall levels of spread of the virus were lower than some of the more apocalyptic modelling had suggested that they would be. End of that first period of the first 3 weeks of lockdown, I and a number of my colleagues have been just pushing a little bit harder for things to be opened up a little bit more quickly. And there have been some obvious things that could have been done sooner. One of them, which I think the science very early indicated, that things that go on outside are generally safer than things that go on inside. So we could have allowed open air markets, for instance, to operate that early. It was possible to go to a supermarket, but not to go to an open air market, which seemed crazy. I think you could have been allowing cafes and pubs that had outdoor space to open. So I think there's a lot more we could have done sooner. And we have maintained this very harsh lockdown for a very long period, essentially 3 months, which has had a really serious economic impact. So I think we recognise that it is going to be necessary to do some quite extraordinary things to make sure that the British economy comes through this with the minimum damage possible. And of course, the first things were contained in that package of support measures put in place by Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, right at the outset, most notably the so-called furlough scheme, which has allowed a lot of employers to keep staff on the payroll, whilst most of the cost has been borne by the taxpayer. That's something that now has to be unwound over the next 2 or 3 months. But it's been an enormous package of support. We need to make sure that as those people go back to work and as the employers are bearing the cost of that employment again, that we also see a growth in confidence and demand. And so in terms of confidence, I think one of the crucial things now, we need to be moving away from that very successful messaging, which is stay at home, and almost the implication that leaving your front door was threatening the lives of all of your neighbours, which was quite an extreme position, but it worked. It was effective. We now need to be moving away from something that says work from home if you possibly can, in my view, to a message that says go to work if it's safe to do so. And as long as sensible precautions have been taken, which are mostly about hygiene, I think, some of it about which direction people are sitting in, who's facing who, and so on, and a little bit about distancing. As long as those measures are in place, we know that it's perfectly safe for most people to be at work. And I certainly made a point of coming back to work in the House of Commons on the 21st of April, as soon as the House came back after Easter, because I think it's important that we demonstrate some sort of leadership and show that it is possible to get back to real life. So the Project Speed announcements, as you say, on the one hand, the opposite of an austerity programme. I think it's also important to note, though, that the 2010 coalition government, whilst containing revenue spending outside some particular areas such as the National Health Service and schools, they allowed quite significant increases in capital expenditure to happen. I think most of this is about infrastructure and about capital expenditure. And a lot of it was contained in the Conservative manifesto back in December, this recognition that one of the ways to unleash the productive capacity of the British economy is to make sure that some of those areas that for too long have been underinvested, have poor infrastructure, poor broadband connectivity and all of the other factors, that they have the investment that enables them to start to participate fully in the success of the British economy. I think overseas investment is hugely important to the United Kingdom. We've always been a very open economy, and we will continue to be. So bringing in overseas investment is a critically important part of the economic success of the United Kingdom, and something that we very often do extraordinarily well. And one of the great success stories of the last few years has been the fact that the UK has been drawing in fintech investment at a massively higher rate than our competitors. I think more than Germany, France, and Ireland combined. So obviously that's something that we want to see continuing, and we want to make sure that there is a welcome given to people who can see the route to economic success in the United Kingdom and can see a way in which they can invest in and benefit from it. I think it is a good time to invest in the UK, not least, of course, because of the depths of the economic downturn that we've seen in the last 3 months. Prior to that, we had a period of steady but unremarkable growth, I think probably held back somewhat by uncertainty relating to the Brexit process. And one of the great fundamental strengths that we have now is that the Conservative Party won the election in December with a very solid majority. So with a majority of 80 in the House of Commons, doesn't mean a blank cheque for governments to do anything that they want to, but I think for things which are core elements of the government's manifesto, whether it be the levelling up of the regions and the infrastructure investment that was promised, or whether it be delivering Brexit on schedule, it gives certainty and clarity. And I think it's important to note in relation to Brexit that certainty and clarity is important not just for international investors, it's also been really important in getting the EU side of the negotiations to respond in a constructive way. Because through the last 3 years, when Conservative governments had a very small majority or no majority, the EU side, which doesn't want the United Kingdom to leave, I think could see a very easy path to frustrating the intention of the referendum in 2016. Now I think they are actually believing that the United Kingdom intends to bring the transition period to an end at the end of the year, and that therefore it is in the interest of both sides to engage constructively in negotiations. And I think for the benefit of overseas investors, I always think it's helpful to set the Brexit vote in the right context, which is that the United Kingdom was always happy to be a European country. We are culturally European. We engage very warmly with our neighbours. We love going on holiday to our European neighbours. Looking forward to doing that again very soon. And we enjoy their culture, as so many of them enjoy ours, and so many come to live and work in the United Kingdom. So it's always a mistake to imagine there's some xenophobic or anti-European reason for Brexit. The United Kingdom has always had a different view of our European engagement, which was more pragmatic, more related to trade, more related to economic benefits. So as the European Union started to develop into something which was far closer to the beginnings of a federal state, it was always a very difficult relationship for the United Kingdom, which has valued its independence, has perhaps always been a little bit stubborn as an island nation, which hasn't been successfully conquered for 1,000 years. So I think once people see that in context, it's really important to many of us that we regain our sovereignty, that we are able to make our own laws in our own democratic institutions. That doesn't mean that we're not prepared to trade with or cooperate with, work warmly together with friends and allies that often have very similar objectives on the other side of the English Channel or the North Sea. So you do get some people who say, oh, so you don't want to change everything. Why on earth was it worth it? And others can see immediately that sovereignty and that freedom to make your own decisions and your own choices is something which is fundamental and which is very special. So I think for overseas investors, they will, I hope, be pleasantly surprised to see that without that friction between a United Kingdom, which wants to be a sovereign independent country, and a European Union, which is gradually developing into a federal state, once that friction is gone, actually the relationship between the UK and our continental neighbours can be easier, can be warmer, and in some ways closer than it was while we were part of Europe. Well, last week I finished chairing the public bill committees on the trade bill. It's a very important piece of legislation which allows all of the existing EU free trade agreements to be rolled over so that we have UK free trade agreements with third countries as soon as we leave the existing arrangements. So for the UK-Japan free trade agreement, there will already be the same agreement that was in place for EU-Japan, but I know it's the aspiration of UK ministers to have a deeper free trade agreement than that and to enhance it in various ways. So I think that is an instance of the upside of Brexit in terms of the ability to arrive at free trade agreements. On the one hand, you get people who say, but it's much easier for a big bloc to use its muscle to get a good free trade agreement because it's a bigger market. But on the downside, if you're a big bloc of different countries with different economies and different priorities, then it's much harder to negotiate a free trade agreement that is really in your interest, because you're always trading off with the interests of your neighbours. So I think for UK and third countries, it's going to become much easier to make those deeper bespoke agreements that benefit the particular strengths of both parties. Altrincham and Sale are very popular with the Chinese community, and it isn't difficult to see all sorts of reasons why. We're close to a major international airport, we're close to the city centre of Manchester, which obviously had a historic Chinese community for many years. It's a pleasant place to live, it's a very safe and secure place to live, it's a good place to do business. But there is an absolutely fundamental reason, and that I don't often quote Tony Blair, but looking back at that 1997 Labour government, when he was asked what his priorities were, it was education, education, education. My constituency probably has the best state schooling in the country, in particular the 4 grammar schools, but also the high schools, which are all of a very high standard too. So the whole system delivers fantastic educational results. And I think for a community which is very invested in education and tends to be very aspirational for its children, to see that fantastic grounding in the local schools, and also perhaps for those who don't want to travel too far after they leave school, a very strong higher education offer in Manchester as well, and many others in the region. So I think until my colleagues are successful in winning changes to the law to allow them to have schools as good as I have in my constituency, then I will continue to see the Chinese community coming to Altrincham and Sale and wider borough of Trafford as their first choice. I really value this opportunity to do an interview with Ying Di. It's a great opportunity to cut straight through and to make sure that some of the people who would otherwise only get a distorted impression through the media, or even worse, through social media, of the views and attitudes of people in the United Kingdom, people in the United Kingdom Parliament, can instead start to get a direct voice, which I hope will help people to come to a more informed decision and to see more clearly the benefits that can come from a close interaction, close investment in the United Kingdom, and the great things that can be achieved together when we do so.